Alright, hey, this is Ben Hellestead, your Jedi warrior for Jesus, and welcome to Operation End Times. This is another boot camp video. It's called Into the Wilderness, Part 1. The first of my lectures of the tribulation, the 70th week, the final 7 years of how to prepare. And what we need to prepare for is going into the wilderness. And the first step is to understand what is the wilderness and why the heck are we going into it. Well, the answer for that is kind of simple. You just got to look in your Bible. You know, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, the wilderness is used by God for His purposes, usually for testing, or for kind of punishing and getting people to come around to seeing the light. That God is almighty and that He will provide and that it's His will, His plans that we got to be tuning into, not our own. So kind of going with that flow, you know, one of the biggest stories in the Old Testament of the wilderness is the children of Israel as they are released from bondage from Egypt, which, you know, Egypt represents a spiritually dark city, you know, an antichrist, the beast. So the children of Israel, through Moses, through the 7 plagues, the Pharaoh finally released them. And as they set about their journey and their escape from Egypt, they basically thought they were going to go marching straight into the Promised Land. And you know, a lot of Christians today, the whole rapture movement, you know, kind of has the free ticket, the pass around the tribulation, like you're going to go straight on in to the Promised Land. But you know what? The Israelites were in for a big surprise. And, you know, they actually brought it upon themselves, because as they got out of Egypt, eventually Moses went up to Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments from God, but while he was doing all that, the children of Israel, they fell away from God. Even though they had seen all the wonders that God had done to help free them from Egypt, it didn't matter. They went back to their old earthly ways of worshiping gold and worshiping, you know, false prophets. So that when Moses came down off the mountain with the 10 Commandments, you know, it was bad news. And what God ended up doing is making the children of Israel wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all the people that had turned their backs on God were either dead or had wised up. And it was only when they were spiritually prepared and had made straight the path, they had recognized this is how you get to the Promised Land, by following God's will. They were allowed to enter into the Promised Land. But you know, the wilderness is used several other times in the Old Testament. You know, King David hid in the wilderness, you know, for his safety. God, a lot of times, sends His believers, the faithful, into the wilderness. And of course, in the New Testament, the most famous story of the wilderness is Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days to be tested and tempted by Satan. And of course, as the story goes, Satan came and he tested Jesus, you know, telling him to make some food out of the rocks. But Jesus said, no, God will provide. And then Satan, he said, you know what? Deny God and follow me, and I'll give you all the riches of the earth, all the kingdom, all the powers of the earth. Jesus said, no, I don't want none of that either. And you know, the devil actually said, you know what, if you're God, throw yourself off of the top of this cliff and save yourself. But Jesus wouldn't fall for that temptation either. And while Jesus was out there in the wilderness, God provided for him. Gave him manna. And you know what? Even in the Old Testament, when the children of Israel were out in the wilderness, God provided for them. Gave them manna straight from heaven. It was some kind of bread. So once again, what does that have to do with the 70th week? Well, if you read Revelations 12, the sign in the sky of the woman giving birth, and the dragon, the fierce dragon that wants to kill her baby and declares war on her and her remnants, God takes her off into the wilderness and protects her. And once again, that's us. That's us, the end time believers. We are good. That's part of the 7 years, the final week, is that we're going to have to go into the wilderness. God will literally take us there. And you know what? When we're in the wilderness, God is going to take care of us. But what the heck is the wilderness? Is it literally like a desert or the top of some mountain out somewhere, some remote location? Could be. Isaiah 40 verse 3, one of the most famous prophecies in the Bible, is the prophet Isaiah says, "A voice in the wilderness will cry out and say, 'Make way the path of the Lord.' And then the mountains will be leveled and the valleys will be raised, and the path will be shown before God's wrath is poured out." And then again in the New Testament, we find John the Baptist, the voice in the wilderness, crying out, "Make way the path of the Lord." And even John the Baptist, Jesus met up with him and was baptized shortly later. But when John the Baptist said this, when he said, "Make way the path of the Lord," he was talking about the end times. Because he once again said the mountains will be laid low and the valleys will be raised up. So there's a purpose for being sent to the wilderness. It's not just to survive, but it's to make straight the path of the Lord. Not only to show the rest of the world, the unbelievers, what the true path is, but to show those that are in the wilderness. Because they're not going to, it may take 40 years, 40 days, 40 minutes. It's hard to say, 40 is this number of testing. 1260 may even be a multiple of 40. But undoubtedly, part of being ready, being prepared, is knowing what the wilderness is and going into the wilderness. And what I'm going to tell you, the wilderness, it could be a remote desert or a mountaintop or some, location with nothing out there. Because for one, because there's nothing out there, you might be safe. But two, you're also going to have to put your trust in the Lord. And to me, that's what the wilderness really symbolizes now that we're in the modern world where we have global everything. The wilderness symbolizes separation from the world. As the world goes global, the mark of the beast, getting a chip to where you can't buy or sell anything without it. Where if you profess your faith as a Christian and your belief in Jesus, you're now an enemy and persecuted, possible martyrdom. Going into the wilderness is separating yourself out from all of that, from the system, from the machine. And it's also putting yourself in a state of total dependency on God for existence. And why are we out there? It's to solidify our own faith, to make right whatever there is between us and God, and to make straight the path for the end times, the final days when God shows up for judgment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end part 1. Let y'all mull it over, get back to me, give me some input. But I think undoubtedly I'm going to expand on this whole wilderness concept because I got to put a little more detail into it about how you get into the wilderness, physical location or mental location. How you put your trust completely in the Lord. Breaking off from society is not that easy. Ghosting, going under the radar. It's going to require some thinking and some guidance from God. All right, hey, this is Ben Hellestead, your Jedi warrior for Jesus. This is Operation End Times with Into the Wilderness Part 1. The time is coming. Could be any day, any minute. But slowly, as the world descends into chaos and our lives, the choice that we're going to have to make on whether to take the easy path, the wide path to destruction, that the whole world will be begging you to take, and turning your back on God versus the hard path, keeping your faith in God, going into the wilderness as the tribulation increases, as life on earth turns against those who believe in Jesus. All right, God bless everybody. Hang in there.